In this video, you will learn the skill of synthesis, which is essentially putting your sources into conversation with each other. What is synthesis in writing? The formal definition of synthesis is a combination of ideas to form a theory or system. When you are asked to synthesize, you are essentially being asked to combine information from various sources to create an original, coherent argument. One metaphor that can help us understand this concept is a braid. In a braid, you take a few strands and weave them together to create something new. In a synthesis essay, the strands are the ideas and evidence from various sources. Another helpful metaphor is the idea of conversation. With this metaphor, you are imagining the writers of various sources sitting around a table talking to each other about the topic. They might completely agree on some points. They might build on each other's ideas and evidence. And they might completely disagree, engaging in counter-argument, concession, and refutation. All of these things that might happen in an actual conversation are rhetorical moves that you can make in your own synthesis arguments. Let's take a moment to distinguish between synthesis and summary. The most important thing to keep in mind when you're writing a synthesis essay is that you are not summarizing other people's ideas. You are advancing your own argument and using the sources to develop your argument. And I should probably pause here and just clarify that when I'm using the term synthesis essay, I'm talking about any piece of writing that you are doing where you take evidence from multiple places and bring it together. It might be that your teacher or whoever is asking you to do this piece of writing is calling it a synthesis essay, or they might call it a research paper. Maybe they're calling it an editorial with research. The idea of a synthesis essay applies to any piece of writing or really any kind of project where you're pulling together information from various places. When you are synthesizing and you're being asked to develop this skill, it's really important that you cite at least 2 different sources per paragraph if you're writing a traditional argument. And if you're creating something that's more non-traditional, you want to keep that same guideline in mind as an absolute minimum. Otherwise, there's a danger that you will write a paragraph that is basically just summarizing a source. If you give yourself that minimum guideline that you have to bring in at least 2 different voices, then you're much less likely to fall into the trap of summarizing instead of synthesizing. Advanced arguments will synthesize 3 to 4 and maybe more sources per paragraph, depending, of course, on the argument, on the paragraph length, and the parameters of the task. So how do we synthesize? These are some of the key moves you might make or reasons that you might synthesize source material. You ought to use source material to do the following. To support your claims with evidence, that's probably the most basic one. You want to use them to clarify ideas, both your ideas and the ideas of another source. You can use source material to extend an idea, whether it's your idea or someone else's. The idea of building on each other's ideas in a conversation, kind of like when you're talking and you say, I want to piggyback off of that idea. I want to extend it. I want to add something to it. To add nuance and complexity to an idea. This is kind of like when you're having a conversation and you say, that's interesting. That makes me think about this. And it's not a disagreement, and it's not exactly the same thing, but it's complicating it. You could do it to introduce a counter argument. This is where you might be talking and somebody might say, I hear what you're saying, but I don't agree, and here's why. The refutation is the here's why. And then, of course, to develop a concession, I think that you're right about this part. So when it comes down to strategies, ultimately I suggest doing what works for you, but I'm going to show you a couple of strategies that have worked for my students in the past and that I think kind of just makes sense. When we are reading a bunch of different sources, the most challenging thing can often be figuring out what to do with all of it and where all of it fits. It's the organizing of it. And so one of the best strategies I've ever used and ever taught is just the simple idea of color coding. After you read through a handful of sources to get a sense of your argument and where you're going, then I would read through them again, this time with an eye to specific subtopics. Maybe you've already defined those subtopics. Then you're going to assign each of those subtopics a specific color. So let's take a look at an example. Here are 3 annotated sources that are all for an argument about how not enough women stay in the STEM field, even though more of them are majoring in STEM subjects in college. So I know that one of my subtopics is going to be reasons why, and specifically not just one reason why, but the idea of gender roles and kind of the sexist attitudes that women can encounter in the workplace. And I know that's going to be one of my subtopics. So I choose a color and I go through my sources, and every time I find a piece of evidence that fits that subtopic, I'm going to highlight it in that color. You can also use note cards. Now these might look a little overwhelming and fancy, but just stay with me here. These are a note card resource that I developed for my students that asks for some basic information. It asks for the author's name. It asks for the pieces of the information. So I want the direct quotation. I want my students to practice paraphrasing and summarizing, and then leaving notes to themselves about how they might use this source. And then also really important is the idea of the subtopic, because that's going to help you group related note cards at a later point. This would be potentially in addition to annotating, but it could also be done instead of annotating, where you read sources and maybe you're just going to go through and highlight all the important information and then sit down with your note cards and copy and paste those direct quotations into note cards and then write your notes about them. So what you'll see on this slide is my note cards are currently organized by author. So I've read 3 sources so far. I have 3 note cards for each, and that's how I've grouped them. But when I go to write, I'm not going to write a paragraph for each author, because that's not synthesizing, that's more like summarizing. So what I want to do instead is reorganize them. So what I'm going to do is look for my subtopics. I notice that I have, under this source, I have 2 cards that are counter arguments. And then I'm skimming the other subtopics. I see here is another counter argument subtopic. So I want to keep those note cards together in a pile. Now I see here is a note card that has to do with a proposal. So I'm going to put that over here for now. I see a note card here about the ineffectiveness of paper bags. I'm going to put that here for now and maybe determine later where it might fit in with the others. Then I see a bunch that are the negative effects of paper bags. This is an argument about really why paper bags might not be better than plastic. It's building off of some states' recent plastic bag bans and how a lot of stores are now giving out paper. And this argument is trying to make the point that paper isn't necessarily better. So now I have groups based on my subtopics, and I'm going to keep my note cards grouped that way. Then I'm going to look at what I have and say, okay, what voices are still missing? What do I still need to fill in? It looks like I might need 1 or 2 more sources to prove why a reusable bag might be better than a paper bag. I might want to spend a little bit more time talking just about why paper bags aren't a good investment. Or maybe that ends up going here, because if my proposal is that we want to buy reusable bags and invest in that rather than the paper bags. Maybe those two things go together. I'll have to give that a little bit more thought. So then the next thing I have to figure out once I have those grouped is, how am I going to organize the ideas within the paragraph? So I've got my separate little note card piles. Now what? When you are deciding how to organize the information you collected for a subtopic, I suggest organizing it in the way that best meets the needs of your audience, which is kind of vague, but it's what you always need to do. Consider what they already know and believe about the subject. Start there and then move them to what you want them to know and believe. So let's keep going with the same example. I have pulled the note cards here that are about the counter argument paragraph, the idea that my audience believes paper is easy to recycle. And this is what a lot of the audience believes, right? That, oh, well, paper is recyclable, so that's definitely better than plastic. It's biodegradable, it's much better. So what I'm gonna do now is take a look at some of my specific information. I might just glance at the summary, I might glance at the paraphrase, I might look at the direct quotation. All of those are possibilities for how I might include the source information. More information about how to make those decisions is in the lesson on integrating sources. But for now, I just want to look at the content and say, okay, what does my audience most likely to already know or believe about my subject? And I'm going to say that my audience actually probably knows that when paper is dirty, or if it's like full of oil and grease or something, then you can't recycle it. It has to be cleaned. Then I'm gonna look and see, okay, this one, paper doesn't break down faster than plastic. Okay, that to me sounds bananas. That's definitely not something I would expect my audience to know. And then this one talks about the chemicals that are required to move the ink and to actually do the recycling of the paper, and how the chemicals are actually harmful to the environment. Something else I actually probably would think my audience doesn't know. So I'm going to want to start, I think, with the idea about how when paper is soiled, it can't be recycled, because that's probably, even if my audience doesn't know that, that's probably not going to be as surprising to them as some of the other facts. And then I'm going to put in the idea that paper doesn't break down faster, because even though this to me is sort of like a big surprise, once it's developed further, the idea that light and oxygen doesn't get in there to help it break down, that starts to make more sense to me. And then the detail about having to add chemicals to the process, that to me seems like something that will come after for two reasons. One, it's what I'm probably least familiar with, but also just in terms of logic, it makes sense that first we have to explain to the audience that the landfill is not an ideal condition for the paper to decompose. Then I would have to look at how the recycling process actually has to add chemicals into it to make that process kind of speed it up. So there's both a logic behind this organization and a meeting the needs of audience organization. And I would say that logic is kind of always meeting the needs of your audience. The last thing here, we're talking a lot about sources. It can be tempting to just let the sources do all the talking, but that is not the idea. Remember that source information is secondary to your argument. It's meant to support your thoughts and ideas. It's meant to back up your claims. It's meant to help you develop your ideas with more clarity and thoughtfulness. Your writing needs to be your voice. If all you're doing is citing other sources, then all you're really doing is kind of stitching together a patchwork of other people's ideas. You're not really creating something that is new and that is yours.